Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and my wormery is just this corner of my basement with these shelves and bins, all composting my kitchen scraps and household waste, whatever I can, even stuff from outside, with worms. The worms live in these different tubs, and every now and then they get a little bit of, stuff like this. They get some kitchen scraps, they get some coffee. I've even got some lovely shredded paper and cardboard with some leaves mixed in for them. All kinds of goodies that I'm feeding these little guys all the time. And what they end up giving me in return is their really nice compost. So the systems that I'm going to be feeding today with this assortment of asparagus, large chunks of asparagus, and a couple leaves of cabbage. There's a green leaf of cabbage in here. Looks like a little chunk of the stem as well. And then there's a leaf of a purple cabbage in here too. The worms that are being fed today are red wigglers. And they're the worms that live in those two trays on the left in the middle row. They're now 10 days into the last feeding that I gave them. And the stuff that I gave them was foods that I assume they really enjoyed. I put down some leaves. I put in carrot peels. There was a banana. And after 10 days, I'm wondering if we're going to see any leftovers of that. Who knows? Might see some banana peel, banana stem. That's pretty likely. As far as that carrot, I don't know. Well, I'm going to put a glove on. We're going to get these systems up on the bench, and we'll talk further while we're feeding them. So let's get to work. Now, in a lot of cases, when I buddy up systems, a lot of times there are systems that were launched on the same day. That's not the case here. These two systems are varying ages. One of them is, well, not that big of a difference. There's about a 2.5-week difference in the ages of these two systems. So, like I mentioned earlier, they do both have red wigglers, but then that's where the likenesses start to diverge. There are different ages, different estimated populations from the day that they were launched, even a pretty big disparity in between how many times each of these systems have been fed, despite the fairly close age. The younger of the bins, the one we're going to feed next, is the population that I refer to as my original worms. And the reason they're a little bit behind on feedings is because one of the feedings that they received was an entire cantaloupe melon, and I had been running a time lapse of them eating that melon. So instead of numerous smaller feedings, they received one over a long period of time. That's the reason numerically they're behind as far as feedings go. But I would have to guess that, quantity-wise, they probably got fed about the same amount. Even though their population is estimated to be bigger than this system. This system was estimated to have been launched with fewer than 1,000 worms. I think every time we come in here, we kind of sense that we've got to sort of refute that estimate of how many worms live in here, because it always does seem to us, just based on the observation of what's happening in here, that there's probably way more than just a 800 and, how much did it say? 829 worms living in here. And after a few hundred days in service too, worms do tend to mate and reproduce and expand their numbers. So even if we did have a pretty accurate starting estimate for this system, it's grown well beyond that as far as I remember. So let's check it out. Let's see here. I pulled off some of those top covering pieces of newspaper, but I didn't really see much of what was left beneath it, which was our feeding zone indicator. I'm pretty sure what we're seeing here is what remains of it. Usually I'll take one of these coffee filters and drape it right over where we last fed to indicate to ourselves where the last feeding occurred. And since I typically feed down the middle, it's not like we're going to have a hard time finding the last feeding. But it's just become a little bit of a tradition in our worm bins here to mark where we last fed, and today we'll do the same. And we're going to have a nice new replacement feeding zone indicator to give them this time. I don't know what this is. I'm wondering if I might have used some of that Amazon tape in a piece of cardboard that they were given. So the fact that I was able to tear it tells me that it will break down eventually, so I'm not going to sweat pulling it out. Sometimes I do bump into synthetic materials that I do want to remove, little chunks of plastic or whatever. But most stuff that I put into the bins has been carefully selected to make sure it's all, you know, biodegradable, compostable stuff that the worms will eventually be able to chew up and eat away. Okay, so we're starting to see some leftover bits of the leaves that we throw in here as bedding for them. I figured this time we would give them some of my prepared bedding, the shredded paper cardboard mix. But we've still got some left over. I guess we could just blend that in a little bit. Now, tomatoes. The tomatoes actually go back 2 feedings. And these were actually the last of the tomatoes that came out of my garden. So 10 days since the last feeding. I don't recall what the feeding interval was between the feeding 10 days ago and the one that came prior. But these leftover tomatoes must have been found as leftovers already last week and still remain as leftovers, oddly enough. There's a little itsy bitsy one. And the funny thing about this one is that I could feel that as I try to press it gently, it's still under pressure. So its skin is still not torn. I think I'm just going to leave it. And we'll see how long it lasts. A little bit surprising to see that they have not yet nibbled this one clean of its contents, although you could see a good little worm party hanging out inside of this particular tomato. And they're nibbling away at it, so it's not going to be long before they finish. It's a little surprising that it's not yet done. So a banana stem, that was probably one of the banana peels that were placed in here last time. However, the carrot, you know, I really don't have a great deal of expectations on finding any carrot peels. The stuff was all frozen, as is today's food feeding. Whenever you take some foods and you freeze them and then that stuff begins to thaw out, it just becomes mush, you know, and then the worms can really rip into it. This would be a little chunk of corn cob, gradually getting whittled down. And we're starting to see a pretty good number of worms hanging out down here in the feeding zone. Definitely more than 829. Like I said earlier, who knows? We probably were pretty accurate on the starting estimate, because it is always with the help of the viewers that we come up with the estimate of how many worms live in my systems. I rarely use a number that's based on just my estimate. That's the reason it's a weird number, like what it is. It's 829 because it's an average. It's all the different estimates that everyone provided, and then I average it. And that's the number I go with. So it's all kind of a joint consensus on what we believe to be the population. But it's always the starting population. A system like this, you know, I don't know, did I bring in the, let's see. Yeah, so 238, that's 34 weeks. 34 weeks, that's a pretty good age for a bin. Plenty of time for the worms to reproduce and for their cocoons to all hatch and those babies to even to have grown to mature age. So I'm sure we've got well over that original estimate of how many worms live in here. Alright, we've created a pretty good sized hole to drop today's feeding in. So like I showed you earlier, I've got this really nice bedding that I created. And I haven't used much of it lately, so it's just been sitting, soaking. And it's pretty damp, because I remember it was a little bit dry when I first whipped it up, and then I dumped a bunch of extra water down into it, resulting in a much more damp prepared bedding than I usually have. And on top of that, we can, oh, you know, let's take these leftover bits, let's drop them into the feeding area too. Not a lot of leftovers, which is kind of nice to see. We even saw a few stems of tomato here. So when I took those leftover tomatoes from my garden, I had a couple stems too, and I figured, what the heck, we'll throw them in here as well. So let's see, we'll give this bin the green, leftovers of the green cabbage, and the other system will get the leftovers of the purple cabbage. However, when it comes to the purple cabbage, they're not getting a nice big hefty piece of the stem of the cabbage. So maybe we should save a little bit additional asparagus for them, so that we give each bin a fair split on the food portion that we bought down here. After all, the other system is a larger population, at least that's what we estimated it to be. I've got the coffee as well, but before we put the coffee in, and maybe we'll give them some worm chow too, I wanted to sprinkle some of these crushed eggshell bits down here for them, and then we could begin sprinkling in this day's worth of coffee. And then we'll hang on to this coffee filter. This will become our replacement feeding zone indicator. So now the worm chow that I mentioned earlier is this stuff right here. It's mainly pulverized bird seed, but I've also got some oatmeal in here. I've got some neem seed meal. I think there was a little bit of cornstarch that I had left over, which I placed in here as well. So it's really just a mix of whatever I've got laying around. Then I run it through the grinder into the little blender, personal blender. We usually end up with a really nice worm chow for these little guys. Nice bite-sized food for them. So let's cover up that feeding area. Perhaps explore the outer edges of the bin a little bit just to make sure things on the outskirts are looking good too, and then we could move on to the original population of worms that lives in the other container. So this system just received its 22nd feeding, and the other system is going to be receiving its 16th. Lots of nice castings piling up over there on the outskirts. Looking good over there, that's for sure. Let's see how this edge looks, and then we could move over to the other bin. I like it when I find worms in all reaches of the bin, not just down where the fresh bedding and food was placed, but even out here on the edges. Tells me that the material is all fair game and the worms are enjoying it. Sometimes I'll even try to pick up some of this residual bits of leaves and whatnot and sprinkle it down into those outer edges too, just to give them extra stuff out there to work on. Very nice. Really nice system. Coming along very well. Do we have any worms on our globe? I don't think so. I think we're all set to cover up and bring out the next bin. Luckily, these top covering papers are holding up pretty good. So we'll just return them. If they were to get really, really worn, we might opt to just include them as bedding in the feeding area as well, but they're holding up good. So we'll return them to service to be considered as possible bedding another day, but not today. Okay. Last thing I'm putting on top is just a little something to provide them with some darkness and shade for when the light streams into the wormery. All right, let's get the original worms out here. You might have saw it earlier. It's right there on the label. I don't know if it's legible or not. Yeah, it should be. It says it clear as day. Original worms. And it's really the only bin that I've got a sample of my original worms living in, because I did have a pretty significant die out of all the systems that I was able to track back to my original batch of worms that I started with way back in the day. And it was look at all those worms hanging out in between the bubbles. It's so cool how they wrap themselves around. So I think we'll just see if we can grab some of these top covering pieces of newspaper in here. Hopefully they're going to stay intact as well, and then I can try to cover up those wormies over on the plastic so they don't freak out from the dry air and the bright lights. I tell you, this paper here feels to me like it might be a futile attempt to try to use it as top covering anymore. Perhaps here we can just incorporate it as bedding, and you know, at this point I don't have anything to cover up the the wormies with. Yes, I do. Here we go. We'll use this piece of just use this piece of newspaper here, and then you know what? This will become our replacement top covering as well. Look at all these nice castings. What a nice system. These original worms, they're doing a heck of a job in here. That other system's older. I usually start with the older of the two bins when I'm feeding this way. So this system was the one that we showed on the list over there as the 220-day-old system. Getting its 16th feeding. So the feeding that each of these systems got last time would have been very similar. So we're starting to see some of the leaves. And we're starting to see some of the leftover banana peel. Actually, a pretty good sized chunk of the banana peel right here. Sometimes I'm a little bit surprised to find such large chunks of banana peel. And then here too, we're even seeing leftovers of the tomatoes out of my garden. And carrot peels, we're not going to find any, I'm sure of it. Almost absolutely certain of that. But we might bump into another couple tomatoes. That wouldn't be too surprising. So once again, referring back to the my little information board, the starting population estimate for this system was 1263, 1,263 worms. Again, I seriously doubt that it would remain stagnant at that estimated worm count. These worms, especially the red wigglers, they just have a tendency to really want to reproduce and expand their numbers and fill out the space that they occupy with babies. Look at all those worms hanging out on that banana peel. They're working it, but it's not quite there yet, so they'll eventually nibble it all away. They'll go for all the soft stuff that's still adhering to the peel and nibble that off first, and then slowly but surely the entire peel will get consumed. It felt to me like I was sort of bumping into another tomato stem. Oh, maybe it's just a stick. I don't know. Stuff like this I tend to just remove because it just doesn't seem like something that's going to go anywhere anytime soon. Yeah, I'm taking it out. I don't know. Some people might figure, can't you just screen it out at the end? I don't know. I don't always screen. Sometimes I just migrate the worms out of the material and then I consider it as a done deal. So if I find stuff that I don't think is going to get broken down, a lot of times I'll just fish it out. Stuff like that. Although my hope is that the tomato stems that we saw in the other system are going to actually break down. But you know, a tough stick like that I doubt is going to break down, so I figured let's get it out of there. This might be a piece of tomato stem, a little piece of it. Or maybe it's a grape stem. It's hard to tell. Probably tomato stem. It's very difficult to tell. So another little piece of tomato there. I believe this right here might be some other sort of little leftover, the peel of something. I don't know what. It almost looks like apple peel. But I don't think we're going to bump into a whole lot more as far as leftovers go. So I think we could begin resetting this feeding and let these little guys get back to work. Yeah, I wonder if we must have given them apple, because this stuff to me almost looks like apple peel just from the appearance of it. This is like another little piece of tomato. But whatever, we don't need to fish out every last little bit of leftover. I like to get a sense of how things are progressing, so I do like to examine the leftovers when I can without going too overboard. But sometimes I do go a little bit overboard, I'll admit. So yeah, this stuff is definitely soaking wet. Normally I don't let my bedding get this wet, but I kind of went hog wild on moistening it last time I was noticing that it seemed a bit dry. So maybe I went a little bit overboard, but I think the worms are going to appreciate that. And then we can drop in these leftovers, little bits of banana peel, a couple leftover tomatoes. Once again, I'm feeling like this one does not give after a certain point, like it's still resisting and showing some pressure on the skin when I press it gently, so that one's not been ruptured yet either. So now we've got one unruptured cherry tomato in each of these systems that we can follow the progress of. All right, let's drop in the remainder of the food that we've got for these little guys. All these yummy bits of cabbage and asparagus. And, oh, that's just the label. I think we got everything. So yeah, the other bin got a pretty good chunk of the inner core of the head of cabbage. And here they just got a leaf. So I think we did give them a few extra pieces of asparagus, to be fair. So that's cool. Looks like we've divvied out the food pretty fairly. And you know what? This might be my opportunity to use this soiled piece of paper towel here as well as a way to get all this moisture off my glove from handling all that really damp bedding. And then in goes the paper towel as well. A little extra supplementary bedding for them. Finally goes in the coffee, but you know what? I almost forgot. I usually like to put the grit onto the food, but I guess in this case we're going to sprinkle it onto the paper. Whatever. And then we'll combine the coffee with the worm chow, which I think seems to make a pretty nice little mix, you know? Sometimes I feel like if I pile coffee in and it goes in like in a big pile, the worms almost don't want to bother with it. But maybe if I mix it with this stuff, they'll just be unable to resist and they'll just eat it all. Or at least that's my hope. All right, very nice, very nice. A couple of really fun bins, you know, and oh, almost forgot. I think we had already decided that this old top covering piece of newspaper was way too far gone to be used for that purpose anymore. So besides a replacement feeding zone indicator, they're also going to get a nice replacement top covering. So before we top cover, we'll backfill the feeding area, and once again, like we did in the other bin, take a little peek on the outskirts, see how things look. Sometimes in the outskirts I worry about stuff getting possibly a little bit too dry, and as a result it would become barren of any worm activity, but I'm not seeing that occurring over on this side. Chances are things are going to look good on this side as well. Although this stuff is really flowing and loose and granular, it still seems to be moist enough that it's keeping the worms interested, because there's all kinds of worms all over the place in the system, in all reaches of it, and that's the way I like it. What this is, some sort of a leftover, so we'll just bury that down there too. Very, very nice. Okay, so now in can come our feeding zone indicator. As far as these top coverings, I thought that maybe we could rip it in half and use it this way so that it provides somewhat better coverage. And that better simulates what we took out of here earlier. All right, we are done. God, these worms, it's so cool how they kind of snake around each bubble. And the reason that they're coming up there is because all that moisture that's present within the bedding that would otherwise evaporate is getting caught by that plastic and condensing there. And the worms just can't resist going for those little droplets of moisture. Hey, if you were a worm, you'd be doing the same thing. All right, everyone, I got a few things I got to take care of getting cleaned up and putting away, but I'm not going to keep you around for that. That's boring. Before I go there really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.